Hey everyone, Pastor Jim here. We're here for another lunch recap, and today I want to talk about a good discussion we had on Sunday in terms of how God is still speaking to us. And so this was part 8 of that series, and this particular title of this message was that God is telling you that He is bigger than this storm. Like I've said the past 3 messages, lunch recaps, all of those things, that if you're going through something right now, prayerfully this is something that can encourage you to let you know that God still has you. He still has you, and He's taking care of things. God is telling you that He is bigger than this storm. So I want to start with our memory verse here, and that's in Job 33:14, and it says, "For God does speak, now one way, now another, though man may not perceive it." And this has been our memory verse for a while now. So I always want to make sure that we understand that God is talking. He's speaking now one way, now another, though we are not putting ourselves in the position to be able to hear Him, to be able to understand Him, or we may not even be listening to see what God has to say, but it does not mean that God is not talking. So what I want to give you another story that we're going to talk about for today for our recap here. And I want to go to Mark chapter 4, verse 35. And I want to read from there, and it says, "When evening came, He said to His disciples, 'Let's go over to the other side.' And verse 36 says, leaving the crowd behind, they took Him along, just as He was in the boat. There were also other boats with Him." And verse 37 says, "A furious squall came up, which is a storm, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped." So again, what's happening here is Jesus is telling His disciples, let's go over to the other side, all right? And they took Him in the boat. So was Jesus there? He had His disciples with Him, and a few other people were there as well too. And it says, while they were on their way to the other side, a storm came up. And the storm was serious. It was something that was putting waves into the boat. The boat that they were in was taking on water. The boat had a real danger of potentially even capsizing, turning over. And this was something that the disciples were actually really afraid of. And so verse 38 says this. It says, Jesus was in the stern. He was sleeping on a cushion. And the disciples woke Him up, and they said to Him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" The disciples are here. They're becoming hysterical here. And they say to Jesus, "Don't you care if we drown? Jesus, help us, do something." And so as we know, what happens here is that Jesus, He gets up, He tells the storm to be quiet and to be still, and it did. And in verse 40, He said to His disciples, "Why were you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" Verse 41, they were terrified, and they asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves, they obey Him." So there's a few things that I happen to pull out of this passage here, and I want to talk about those things so we can discuss them one by one. And the first one is this. Even when you are listening to God, you can have a difficult storm come up in your life. It's very important that we realize that even when listening to God, you can have a difficult storm come up. You know, many times we tend to think that, oh, well, if you're doing everything that God says, then everything's going to be fine. There's not going to be any problems. You're not going to run into any kind of issues or anything like that. And we also feel like, well, if you do run into problems, then you're not fully listening to God or doing what He said. What did you do? Are you not being obedient? Well, we discussed in John 16:33, it says, "I told you these things so that in me you may have peace. But in this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world." In this world you will have trouble. That includes everybody. So listening to God does not mean that you will not run into issues in life. It's unfortunate, but it's the truth here. In the situation here in Mark, in the story we're talking about, it was Jesus's idea for the disciples to go over to the other side. Now, why is this a problem, this whole storm situation? These men were not strangers to the water. Most of them were fishermen. You would think that because that was like a way of life for them, that it was something that they did before they started to follow Christ, that they knew about being on the water. They knew how to swim. They knew how to fish. And you would think they'd been in a bad storm or two. They go out there on the boat. You think they would not have seen a storm or 2 or 3 or 100? They've seen a lot of storms, and they learned what to do during bad weather. But for some reason, this storm was different. And it says in verse 48, Mark chapter 4, it says Jesus was in the stern sleeping on a cushion. He was asleep. The disciples woke Him up and said, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" Now that statement is very important. Don't you care if we drown? Remember, these guys were the experts. If it was just a small storm, why would they be worried? Is this not something that they would deal with on a regular basis? You would expect the people who are experts at a particular thing to be able to handle the small stuff unless it is something that is extremely big. No, this was something that the disciples were not prepared for. If we drown, that was a full extreme, wasn't it? They were not ready for this. And that leads us into the second thing here. Remember, some of the biggest storms may come up when you are listening to and following God. But if he sent you to it, he will carry you through it. Listening to God, listening to Jesus is what put them out there in the water in the first place. And it was a storm that they thought was going to kill them. But if he sent you to it, he will carry you through it. And so remember, again, in verse 38, Jesus was asleep. He was in the stern sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" Verse 39 says he got up, he rebuked the wind and said to the waves, "Be quiet, be still." Then the wind died down and it was completely calm. Now, they said to him, "Jesus, help us through our storm," essentially. Now, they said, "Don't you care if we drown?" All right. But they said, "Jesus, help us through our storm." And from the message and the discussion last week, Peter, who was walking on the water, began to sink in his problem. He says, "Lord, save me." And as soon as he said something, that's when Jesus responded, which leads us to the third thing here, that if you are needing God to work on your behalf, tell him. Peter was sinking. He asked for help. Immediately, Jesus grabbed him. The disciples asked for help. "Don't you care if we drown?" Jesus got up and he calmed the whole storm. There's something about asking God to do something that causes him to respond on our behalf. There's a scripture here in Matthew chapter 7, verse 7, and it says, "Ask and it will be given to you." Ask. It says, "Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be open to you." And verse 8 says, "For everyone who asks receives, and he who seeks finds, and to him who knocks, the door will be open." Ask and it will be given to you. It doesn't say that not ask and you can get it. It says ask and it will be given. There's something about asking God, and he responds to that. John chapter 14, verse 13 says, "And I will do whatever you ask in my name, so that the Son may bring glory to the Father." Another one here in 1 John chapter 3, verse 21 and 22 says, "Dear friends, if our hearts do not condemn us, we have confidence before God and receive from him anything we ask because we obey his commands and do what pleases him." You know, I made a mention on Sunday, well, we don't always have a desire to want to ask. Like sometimes we have the mindset, doesn't God see me struggling? Why should I have to ask? Doesn't God know? If God sees all and knows all, he sees that I need this particular thing. Even though God does see all, the Bible still tells us to ask. Some of us are waiting on God to act. We're waiting on him to do certain things for us. But he's really waiting on us to ask. We're waiting on God to act, but he's waiting on us to ask him. And so that leads to the fourth thing about storms here. And it says that we try our best to make it through our storms. But don't forget that God has the power to end the storms. This storm right here that the disciples were caught up in and Jesus was asleep on, this was a all hands on deck emergency here. But something that they thought was going to take them out only took 3 words from Jesus to end. Quiet, be still, done. Many of us don't look at our storms that way. We tend to think to ourselves, if we can just make it to the end of the day, we can get enough strength, we can rest a little bit to deal with this same storm all over again. We're trying to find ways through the storms, but not trying to find an end to the storms. God is telling us that there can be an end to these storms. And here's the thing right here, another one too. There are some problems we can't solve on our own. Don't forget we serve a God who has power over everything. God has power over everything. 2 weeks ago, if you've been watching either our lunch recaps or if you've been listening to the messages, Jonah was told to go to Nineveh to preach against it. When he decided to go do something else, when he got on that boat to go away, it says that God caused a storm that caused problems for everybody. And when the people who were on the boat with Jonah, when they threw him off, the storm ended. Last week, Jesus told the disciples to go across the water while he stayed to pray. And then ultimately, when he goes out and he's walking on the lake, He was going to walk past them. But it says also that the storm stopped when he and Peter got into the boat. Something is controlling these storms, and it's based on something that God is doing. So it shows that God has control over these storms. Now, I said this last week, and I think this is important for us to remember as well too, is that our storms are an opportunity to see how big God is. God is saying that we can ask him. We can ask him to take care of our problems, to take care of our storms, and he can respond to those storms. And he has shown control over them, that he can end those storms as well too. And so after Jesus calms the storm, in Mark chapter 4, verse 40, he says this. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" Jesus asked them, he said, "Why are you so afraid, y'all? Where's your faith?" And so that leads us to the fifth thing here. And it says, if you have God with you, you don't have to be afraid of anything. When Jesus did all of this stuff, these people thought they were going to die. They thought they were going to drown. Jesus gets up and he calms the storm. And he tells me, he said, why were y'all afraid in the first place? The question is that if you got God with you, what do you have to fear? Is God not bigger than our storms? Is God not bigger than our trials? Is God not bigger than the things that we go through, our problems? Is he not bigger than those things? There's a scripture in Psalm chapter 56, verse 3 and 4, and it says, "When I am afraid, I will trust in you." Verse 4 says, "In God, whose word I praise. In God I trust, I will not be afraid. What can mortal man do to me?" And that's the question. What can anybody do to you if you have God with you? If God is for you, who can be against you? And that includes your storms as well too. What storm can stand up to your God? Whatever it is that you're going through right now, if it's something that you have on your job, what storm can stand up to your God? Something that's going on in your home, what storm can stand up to your God? If it's something that's going on with your family, what storm can stand up to your God? If it's something that's going on in your own body, what storm can stand up to your God? If it's something that's attacking you in your mind or in your spirit, what storm is bigger than our God? In your accounts, your investments, in your relationships, in your friendships, what storm can stand up to your God? What enemy, what thing can come for you that can stand up to your God? It's not one, because God has control over everything. Psalm chapter 23 and 4, familiar psalm that we probably all know. It says, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For you are with me, and your rod and your staff, they comfort me." Now, something I think that we should do each day. If you still make affirmations each day, you can make biblical affirmations as well too. But remind yourself each day that God will take care of you. So let's finish the story. Mark chapter 4, verse 41, it says, "They were terrified and they asked each other, 'Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him.' Christ got up in front of all of them. This storm that they thought were going to kill all of them. And he said, 'Quiet, be still,' and the storm just stopped." They were afraid of this man. They were terrified. Who is this person? This was something that they didn't know. They had spent time with Jesus, but they didn't fully know what he could do. And how would they know if they hadn't seen it? And so the sixth thing is that sometimes you can't see what the storm was for until God brings you out. But don't worry, God is doing something. Now remember, these were the disciples who were with Christ. And if they were going to be disciples, then they needed to know the power of God. How else would they be able to have faith in him if they could not see the power of God? Yes, Christ could tell them, but it's something different when you see it. And it's the same thing with you. How do you know how big God is unless you've seen him work on your behalf? The things that you've seen God do. Nobody can come and tell you, what God can do because you've seen it. Nobody can come and tell you what God can't do because you've seen it. You've seen him do things in your life. You've seen him work the miraculous. You've seen him calm storms in your life. You've seen him do all of these things. You've seen time and time again how God can deliver you through your trials. You've seen time and time again how he can deliver you through the things that you go through on a regular basis. You've been able to see examples of his goodness and his favor. Now I'm going to say this right here. With all of the things that you're seeing, you are being able to see God work. And if God worked then, he can work now. And with the closing I gave before, God does speak now one way, now another, though we may not be the ones that perceive it. God is talking, but there may be times that he's not talking to us. He's talking to our storms, the things that are going on in our life, telling those things to be quiet, to be still. Ask God to speak to your storm today. So I pray that that was a blessing for you. If it was, if you would give it a like and share it with somebody, it would be greatly appreciated. We want to get the word to as many people as possible, because in this world you'll have trouble. Somebody's going through something and they need encouragement to know that God can handle their storms, that he can handle their problems. So I pray that you help us by sending those things out. You are by all means welcome to come and visit us on Sunday mornings. You can find us at 1800 John Rogers Drive, Birmingham, Alabama, 35210. Our services are at 9:30. And so until the next time, I want to allow you guys to enjoy your lunch, okay? But until then, I'm Pastor Jim. Y'all take care. God bless. Talk to you soon.